Welcome to Radio TurnSpeak from turnspeak.com. The views expressed by guests of TurnSpeak do not necessarily represent those of TurnSpeak Radio. Your host today is Jesse Wall.
Hello and welcome to TurnSpeak. Today we have as our guest Christine Maggiore, who is responsible for the documentary The Other Side of AIDS, along with her husband Robin Scovill. How are you doing, Christine?
I'm doing well, thanks.
So I've been reading on your website about your daughter EJ and what happened to her. It's quite a tragedy, and I'd like to talk about it as much as you're willing to.
It's certainly a topic that's been discussed widely in the media and at blog sites, and most of those discussions have very little to do with the facts of the matter, so I'm happy to discuss the facts.
Okay, great. Before we get started on that, can you give us an introduction, an overview of what you've done concerning AIDS? Basically, you started off going up against the AIDS drug industry, essentially, right?
Well, I wouldn't characterize it like that. What happened is in 1992, I took what's called an HIV test at the recommendation of a doctor I was seeing, just for a regular checkup. And she recommended the test as a matter of social responsibility, and I did it on that premise. I had no complaints of ill health, no reasons to believe I was, quote, at risk. And it just wasn't anything that factored into my everyday thoughts, AIDS, except as a news story, as something to write a check to, and so forth. I was very shocked and devastated when I tested positive. And as a response to that, after I got over some of the shock, shame, and devastation, I got into public speaking work on behalf of several prominent AIDS organizations. And about a year into my diagnosis in public service, I ran into a doctor who suggested that I retest. She said I didn't fit the profile of an AIDS patient. I retested, and my results came back indeterminate, positive, negative, and then positive. And that's what caused me to start questioning what I was taught to teach people. And those questions led me out of the mainstream I was sharing with people. It was a memorized speech that I would give, and I was very passionate about it, but I realized it wasn't answering the questions about my life or the questions that developed as a result of these conflicting test results. So in trying to find answers, I took my questions outside of that, and that ultimately led to me having more questions, fewer answers, and finding practical explanations for the gaps in our understanding about HIV and AIDS in a body of literature that's often referred to as dissident literature. But it's, science, medicine, and epidemiology. It's just the conclusions that it draws conflict with what most of us have come to believe is absolute truth on this topic. So that's more accurate, I guess, way to describe the trajectory of my interest in this and where it's propelled me.
And what is your current view on the subject of AIDS? It seems like AIDS went through kind of a lull for a couple years there where it wasn't really, there wasn't much media coverage of it, and it just wasn't really, it didn't seem to be in the popular consciousness all that much. And they seem to be artificially trying to reawaken that consciousness in the public by advertising new AIDS drugs, etc., although they've been doing that all along. And then also talking about AIDS vaccines. And it seems like they might be giving a little bit more funding to things like, AIDS runs and AIDS charities and stuff like that in order to hype it up a bit. What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's been grafted into our social conscience, this idea of AIDS, and the idea that it's this simple formula. HIV equals AIDS, treatment equals life, sex equals death. And those are really easy mantras to put in people's heads. And clearly this goes forward through massive PR efforts. Every AIDS organization of any note has a major PR firm working for them to place news, to keep this alive in the public conscience. And consciousness. If it were not there, we wouldn't be funding it to the degree that we do. And if you look at the funding that goes to AIDS in this country, it is so completely, outrageously disproportionate to how many people are affected by this. Many, many more lives are taken by heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, septicemia, sepsis, those kinds of diseases, suicides, car accidents. All kinds of problems occur in far, far greater proportion than AIDS does, yet AIDS has just an incredible amount of funding, government funding, taxpayer money devoted to it. This is completely disproportionate to the problem that exists, and the only way that disproportionate funding is enthusiastically allocated is by perpetuating the notion that everyone's at risk. Mm-hmm. If you notice, not very many people have AIDS. You know, rock stars, athletes, the people down the street. It occurs rarely, and if we didn't pump up our consciousness, it would be a background disease. It would be a background situation. It wouldn't be something we'd have on the front page of the New York Times constantly. And we've done two things to keep it in the public conscious and to also keep the number of AIDS patients at a certain level. In 1993, the United States changed the definition of AIDS to include people who weren't sick. People with no clinical symptoms of illness, no evidence, clinically speaking, of immune suppression in 1993, and since then can become AIDS patients simply by testing positive on this nonspecific antibody test and having a laboratory marker that suggests their T-cell count, that is a measure of what's supposed to be indicative of how the immune system is functioning, is, quote, low. That alone is enough to receive an AIDS diagnosis, and that alone has been responsible for more than 50% of all new AIDS cases in this country since 1993. The other thing we've done.
So what do you think is the motivation behind this? Why is the AIDS industry as huge and bloated as it is?
It's well, I used to work in advertising and marketing, and I know how those things work. Once you have something going, you keep it going. Before AIDS came along, we had a core of government scientists at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control who were struggling to find a reason to be. They were virologists who had focused for 10, 15 years during this period of time, Nixon's war on cancer, on the idea that all cancers were contagious, caused by viruses. When that proved to be of insignificant help to understanding, treating, diagnosing cancer, they didn't have a lot to do because bacterial diseases had been conquered with antibiotics, and so you have viral illnesses, and then you have the possibility that genetics may hold some key to something. So if you've got a bunch of virologists and geneticists sitting around with not much to do, and someone comes along and suggests that there's a new viral epidemic, that's exciting. That's inspiring. That's funding. The system begins not because anybody said, hey, let's pull one over, but because the system begins because it's a system, and the system works that way. And when the system hears potential viral epidemic, well, you've got all sorts of enthusiastic virologists who say, wow, I want to be on the frontier, I want to be on the cutting edge, I want to be a part of this, I want to put my skills to use and solve this problem. And the way the problem was presented to them, practically no one engaged in any scrutiny of what was being told, that this virus had been discovered that was the probable cause of AIDS, and it went in 24 hours from probable to the AIDS virus. And everyone went along with this. It became a very, very rapidly moving bandwagon that enough people jumped on, and then you had an entire lobby of gay activists who were concerned about the deaths in the gay community, the illness in the gay community. And when this viral hypothesis came up, this was something that was celebrated and could be used to suggest, just like the flu, this would be everybody's problem, except on the level of a sexually transmitted disease. Flus supposedly pass through casual contact. But, who in their lifetime doesn't, sooner or later, have intimate contact with someone else. So the potential for everyone at risk was also a big motivating factor in creating a worldwide industry around notions of HIV and AIDS as we understand them.
Now, what about, aside from the economic factors, do you think there's anything more conspirational and sinister behind their motives? I think that there may be some social control mechanisms in their motives.
I am not conspiratorial in my thinking. I'm pretty practical. And I can see just using a template, business as usual, to see where all this goes. But business is not benevolent. Business is business. Business is bottom line. Business says you've got an industry, you've got to keep it going. You've got to find new markets. You've got to find new products. You've got to find new ways to sell them. And if you look at the cancer industry, the AIDS industry, these are big businesses. They employ many, 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 many people. I don't think you need to see this through the lens of a conspiracy to see how these things happen. It's
more about job security for all the scientists and then all of the PR people involved with the AIDS and then all of the charity organization people, especially in like the heads of the charities and stuff like that who are making a lot of money. So basically, you're saying that they spend their time promoting AIDS so that it continues, so that they keep their jobs, their cushy jobs.
I don't think they wake up in the morning and say, I know I'm doing something wrong, but I'm going to keep doing it because I got to pay the rent, I got to pay the mortgage, I just bought a new car. But our tendency as human beings is not to inconvenience ourselves with, as Al Gore said, inconvenient truths. How many people are willing to put themselves out of a high-paying, prestigious job so they can speak up about something that they see is wrong? It's human nature to turn a blind eye to what is not convenient to your own perpetuation.
I don't know. I think that's low human nature, Christine. I think that there are people out there who are noble. I think there are people out there who are noble enough to speak up.
I agree with that. And I wish there were more. Some people don't know enough to speak out, and many people. Well, I just got, you mentioned my husband's documentary film at the beginning of this discussion, The Other Side of AIDS. We recently received a very heartfelt email from a young woman who had put off watching the film for quite some time, having it presented to her by her boyfriend. And she didn't want to watch the film because she was working in the AIDS industry as an advocate, a treatment advocate, a counselor. And it was only after she left her position for reasons of her own that were disappointments and problems within her job that she was able to see the film. And once she watched the film, she saw, I think, what she was afraid she was going to see, which was a lot of reasons to question the direction of all of her charity work over the last 5 to 7 years, which was paying her income. Yeah, I mean, it was her job to do these charitable acts that she's now grappling with. Did I do more harm than good? What was it I was seeing when I was seeing these things? I was told to see through this lens of, HIV equals AIDS, treatment equals life, sex equals death. What were the facts behind these ideas? And she says she thinks that she now can say she was a part of the problem and not really part of the solution. That is a very hard thing to see and say, but people do it all the time, and it's beautiful.
Yeah. So why is AIDS still in existence in the mass consciousness? I mean, Peter Duesberg came out in, 94 or even earlier than that, a respected professor at Cal State Berkeley, challenging the notion that HIV causes AIDS and even that HIV exists. Why in 2007 why have things not changed for the better?
One of the aspects of Peter Duesberg is I think his first paper challenging the HIV/AIDS paradigm came out in 1987. And there's archives of, I believe this can be seen on the Rethinking AIDS website. They have archives of old Rethinking AIDS newsletters. And there's one in which there's a photocopy reproduction of a memo that went out from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in response to Duesberg's article challenging the HIV/AIDS paradigm being published in the medical journal Cancer. Now, scientists publish challenges all the time. That's how we learn. Somebody says, hey, I discovered this, and this is what it looks like. And somebody says, hey, I can't see that same thing. What I'm seeing is this, and that's how we learn. In this particular instance, the process of moving science forward was regarded by government officials as a threat. They are asking in this memo, how did this get published? What is this going to do? We're all going to look stupid. People are going to think we blew it, and now they're not going to know. They think they're not going to know what's causing AIDS, and there's going to be a panic. And the government immediately took the position of, we can't let this. I think they use the word contain. We need to contain this. And that's what happened with Peter Duesberg. He got shut out of the system. They put him in a container called, you can't get any more funding. And that has been his story ever since. He's gone from an eminent researcher to getting every grant proposal approved, to being a member of the Academy of Sciences, to being a Scientist of the Year, to not being able to even keep his lab open at UC Berkeley without private funding.
But doesn't that scream, Christine, seriously, doesn't that scream of conspiracy? I mean, in the 80s, the AIDS drug industry hadn't really matured yet at all, right? In 1987, when he is supposed to have published this paper. So that means that there wouldn't have been that big a lobby, at least compared to the size of the lobby in the 90s and now. So what would the motivation of the government, especially the government, mind you, not private companies, be in trying to contain Duesberg's revelations?
Well, the government operates in an almost paternalistic fashion in this country. The government takes care of its people. And daddy government, let's call it, made an announcement, endorsed the scientist who said he found the probable cause of AIDS. It was a sexually transmitted disease. All these alarms went off. The blood supply needed to be screened. People were concerned. Lives might be at risk. How do you go and say, oops, I may have spoke out of turn. I may have said something without understanding the gravity of the situation. People find it hard to say that about whether or not their kid should have a bag of M&Ms. And this is our government talking not just to our country, but the world. I mean, that's a pretty big misstep to take. And at that time, there was no Internet. Mm-hmm. Back then, people could not communicate except through the filters of the media. And the media, we know, when every single AIDS organization and the U.S. government all use the system of public relations to put forth ideas and policies. You know, you don't need a conspiracy. It's human nature and business as usual. How many people can admit to small mistakes, let alone on a large scale? It takes exceptional people. Do we have exceptional people leading our country?
Well, I would say no, that we don't. And if you were to compare like this AIDS campaign to the Iraq War, I mean, they're both equally botched jobs, aren't they?
I would say that HIV is the medical equivalent of yellow cake uranium. The medical equivalent of yellow cake uranium. If you look at the AIDS war and the war on terrorism, Bush was able to engage the hearts and the minds and the budget and the participation of enough of the American people in leadership to wage a war against Iraq based on the notion there were weapons of mass destruction, that yellow cake uranium had been sold, and that this was an imminent threat not only to people there but people all over the world, people in our country most especially. Based on that false premise, we engaged in this war. Now we know that that is not correct, but the machine's in place. Mm-hmm. What do we do? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of similarities between that and the war on AIDS, and it just constantly surprises me that the liberal left, who just so vigorously questioned Bush, who have, I think it was the what's-his-face Kennedy. I don't mean any disrespect by not being able to recall his first name. But he works with Bono, and writes articles about the non-scientific nature of Bush administration with regard to environmental issues, with regard to war policy, with regard to all kinds of things. Yet, when it comes to HIV and AIDS, there's no skeptical analysis. This is the only issue, if you look at it, that has across-the-board consensus. On this one issue, the left agrees with the right. On every extreme is that the far left and the far right actually agree on one issue. Many, many people think Bush is a bad president who has misrepresented so many issues, who has not been honest and forthcoming, he's been manipulative, but ain't he right on the AIDS issue? He wants to spend billions of dollars. It's odd how there's this, the thinking caps come off so easily when it comes to AIDS.
When it comes to sex, people fear sex. People are ashamed of sex. It's an extension of Puritanism.
That very well could be. I think they fear death more.
Yeah. Oh, right. Well, and then if you're saying sex equals death in the AIDS issue, which I've actually thought it myself too, and so
I mean,
if you mix the two, then it's a potent combination.
Yeah. The mantra, treatment equals life. There are no studies in the medical literature that show groups of HIV-positive people divided in two cohorts. One's taking the AIDS treatment drugs, one's not taking them, that the cohort taking the AIDS treatment drugs live longer and have better clinical health than the ones who are not taking the AIDS drugs. Sex, the idea that treatment equals life is an advertising mantra. Coca-Cola is Coke. You know, a Whopper is when we have so many things where we don't even know it's marketing and advertising. For example,
I mean, that's becoming more obvious since they deregulated pharmaceutical advertising on television, right? Where you see that like half of the advertisements on American television now are for pharmaceuticals. I'm in England, and I think that pharmaceutical ads are still banned here, so you don't see any, which is really good.
Yeah, the largest lobby to our U.S. government is the pharmaceutical industry. So there's a huge conflict of interest. Yeah. I was just reading a January 2nd essay that appeared in the New York Times about what's making America sick. And it's something that has been expressed. I don't know if you've seen it in the UK. The UK journals coined a term for it, disease mongering.
No, I haven't heard that.
Where we have an epidemic in this country of diagnoses.
Yeah,
We're calling everything that human beings go through in the course of being human beings a medical problem that can and should be treated with drugs.
With prescription pills, right.
You eat lousy food and you have gas, well, that's acid reflux. Don't change your diet. Take a little pill.
Right, or if you're socially inept, take a pill.
Yeah, if you get nervous in business meetings and you're bouncing your leg up and down, that's nervous.
Take a pill, right? Yeah.
Take a pill.
Yeah.
If you wake up on Monday mornings and it just seems like there's nothing much that you have to look forward to in the week, don't look at your life. Take a pill. If your kid can't sit still and listen in the classroom, or just as a kid, in the classic sense of being a kid, give them a pill.
Yeah, and every time you have a headache, take a couple Tylenols, right?
Yeah, don't ever look to the root cause of what might be your trouble, and don't think that perhaps that trouble might have something to do with what you do or think or eat or how you live your life. Just take a pill. I think we see this in a lot of areas, and the need for conspiracy, I just feel it doesn't even need to be there.
No, I see your point. It's
so
a very good point.
And marketing.
It's a very good point. But you have to understand that your explanation of the economic motivations behind the scenes actually does blend in a little bit with conspiracy theory, just from the other side of the spectrum.
I'm talking about, like, if you study business, like Milton Friedman. This guy's I think he won a Nobel Prize for his writings on one of the topics that just fascinated me. The corporation has no conscience. The corporation has no duty. The corporation has no moral, ethical obligations. The corporation exists as a corporation, and its job is to make money.
Yeah.
So in a paradigm where that is so, you don't need a conspiracy because you have groups of people functioning as money-making machines.
The corporation is the conspiracy.
One could say that. To me, someone brought this up recently, and I thought it was a very, very valid discussion. It used to be that when people questioned something of governmental, social nature, and those questions were inconvenient and led other people to question them, like in Russia, they were called crazy, and they were put in mental institutions. These dissidents are crazy. We got to get them institutionalized. You can't question these things. Now, instead of calling people crazy, we dismiss them by calling them conspiracy theorists. Mm-hmm. That's why I object to that word, because it's a dismissive term. No one says, gosh, I have so much respect for that conspiracy theorist.
Right. That's an
People
excellent point.
have respect for Noam Chomsky, but they don't have respect for somebody who might be as brilliant and more right on, and he's called a conspiracy theorist rather than an intellectual.
Mel Gibson.
And, I don't know.
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
I don't know what I think of Mel Gibson.
What about what's going on in Africa? How does it differ from what's going on in Western civilization?
Well, I was going to bring up the subject of Africa in relation to what you said of, why is this constantly in the media? And what we've seen here is we don't have an AIDS epidemic in this country if you use the normal standard definition of what an epidemic is, affecting lots of people, transmitting, involving, person-to-person contact, reaching peak points, and it's just not happening in that manner. And I know for many people who have been affected by this, and I could certainly be considered one, it can feel like an epidemic when so many of the people you know are touched by this and lives have been lost all around you. This can feel like an epidemic. But when you look at the numbers of what takes lives, what makes people sick in this country, AIDS is on a very, very, very low rung of the ladder of true concern.
Yeah, do you have
so what do we do?
What
do we do to keep the public interest?
Do you have some numbers for
Africa?
us? Do you have any numbers for us about what the number of people that die of AIDS in the United States is?
I wouldn't want to say that right now just off the top of my head because I feel like I want to stand behind everything I say, and I have not looked at the most recent CDC data. What I've been looking at recently is comparative numbers between cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, car accidents, suicides, and AIDS is consistently on the low rung of any ladders of diseases in this country.
Okay.
To what number, I don't want to speak without knowing that exact number, but anyone can log on to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control website and see those numbers and be similarly underwhelmed. Mm-hmm. When you think of how many people we have in this country, and then you factor in, take out 50% of those people who aren't sick when they get an AIDS diagnosis, yet AIDS came into being as this mysterious sickness. People were actually sick. Now you have AIDS, you're not even sick. You don't have to be sick.
Yeah, so
and in
what
Africa,
is it?
We have an entirely new way of looking at AIDS. AIDS is a manifestation of estimates and projections, and it's also people who are suffering from diarrhea, fevers, cough, weight loss, which can be caused and are caused by numerous endemic challenges on that continent. Lack of clean water, lack of food, civil war, drought. I mean, people seem to forget that currently right now there's over 100 wars going on in this world, affecting people, having people move from their homes and suffer. The suffering on the African continent has and is enormous. In the last 20 years, the World Monetary Fund, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank have imposed regulations that take money out of infrastructure to support African nations and African people. There's system breakdowns and people suffer. We are now calling that suffering AIDS. And it's very, very schizophrenic. If you look at this carefully, the AIDS industry talks out of both sides of its mouth. Let me give you an example. I recently saw in People magazine an advertisement put out by GlaxoSmithKline, who makes many AIDS drugs. This advertisement, however, was not about AIDS drugs. It was about a program they've initiated in Africa to bring clean water because lack of sanitary living conditions and lack of clean water cause tremendous disease burden. And they list the top killers of children under 5 in Africa. Guess what's at the very, very bottom at 3%?
AIDS.
HIV/AIDS.
Really?
Now,
even in Africa?
HIV, it's right there in People magazine.
Yeah.
Right there. Right there. But, this is the same entity that produces AIDS drugs and wants to tell us that we need, as Americans, to send billions and billions of dollars of toxic drugs to people who don't have clean water to swallow them, who don't have the food to have in their stomachs to assimilate them. It was just recently noted in a scientific study that, I believe it was in the country of Uganda, that it was discovered that people taking the AIDS drugs became more likely to die, and this is being attributed to the fact that they don't have a strong enough constitution due to malnutrition to survive these very, very toxic chemicals.
Yes.
Everyone knows these drugs are toxic.
Yeah.
People mostly know that you cannot live without food, clean water, basic medical care, and in a safe and decent home. And probably the only entities out there doing anything about it are Angelina Jolie and Dr. Jeffrey Sachs in the Millennium Villages and the Millennium Project, the Heifer Foundation, which sends people all over the world what they need to sustain themselves, their families, and their communities, and organizations working on clean water and teaching people how to grow crops and use manure for fertilizer, becoming self-sustaining. Our government is telling people, you need us and you need these expensive drugs or you have no future and no hope, and this is based on estimates and projections. We get our numbers from Africa based on something called sentinel testing, where women in antenatal clinics are administered a single test called an Eliza. It's a HIV antibody test that, of course, doesn't really test for HIV antibodies. It tests for our body's antibody response to a series of proteins thought to be part of or represent or be linked to HIV. Problem with this test is right in some of the first lines of the test kit literature, it very clearly acknowledges that pregnancy can cause false positive reactions. Mm-hmm. And when you have more than one pregnancy, your odds of this false positive reaction increase. So who are they giving this test to, this sentinel testing? Pregnant women. On the African continent, the average woman has 5 childbirths in her lifetime. So we're giving it to people who are very, very likely to test positive. They test small groups of people, feed these numbers into computers in Geneva, Switzerland, at the World Health Organization, and spit out all these dire predictions. But if you go to the countries and you say, I want to go visit a hospital, I want to see the AIDS ward, I'd like to see what's going on here, we've done that, you find starving people, and doctors perfectly willing to tell you, yeah, they're starving. And when you're starving, it's really hard to fight off anything, a cold, the flu, an amoebic infection, a parasitic infection. We went to the coffin makers in South Africa who are supposed to be working overtime to keep up with all of the, projected AIDS cases we hear about. Uh-huh. Most of them were closed for business. A lot of them were selling furniture, used clothing to keep, the thing going on. It's not like, we didn't see people marching around with a funeral every day here and there. What we saw were people living in homes made of scrap metal, cardboard, wood, anything, in freezing cold temperatures, with nothing to keep them warm, with water supplies that were open, where cattle, anyone could defecate near that water supply, open to mosquitoes. people who were not working, who no one in their family was working, who were hungry. And our AIDS industry is going in and saying, you know, you got AIDS.
Right.
And we're going to solve all your problems. Treatment equals life. You want life? Here, we got it.
Yeah, in this toxic drug.
One thing that I really respect that I saw that Peter Piot, who's big AIDS guy with the World Health Organization, he went into Malawi, and there's a quote from him where he says, when I go into a country, I ask the people what it is they need. And he's there under the banner of HIV and AIDS, yet he asked this question, and the answer was, we want food. We don't want condoms. We don't want talks about abstinence. We don't want drugs. We want to eat. We want to eat. And the sad thing is now there's this big, huge campaign to test everyone on these nonspecific antibody tests in Malawi. You're starving. You're ill. You have a grand chance of coming up positive on these nonspecific tests. Then what's going to happen? Oh, World Health Organization, we need toxic drugs. So they're going to give them to hungry people. We've already seen what happens when you give them to people who are really hungry. They don't have the capacity to survive these things.
So just to summarize what your stance is on the HIV test, for listeners who haven't heard you speak before, you're stating that the HIV test is nonspecific, meaning basically that it's inaccurate and therefore probably invalid. Is that correct?
I don't have a stance on the HIV test. I just cite from the literature on the HIV test itself. Every single test, if you look at the literature, disclaims itself from being used to diagnose HIV infection.
Really? It does? You're kidding? Really?
No, I'm not kidding. I'm serious. Let me give you a quote, and I'll bring this back to that marketing concept.
Okay.
We have a test called viral load. I mean, you hear that word and you think, a load of virus. It's measuring the burden, the amount, it's this huge quantity of the load of virus. But just as a hamburger can be called a Whopper, it doesn't mean that it's bigger, larger, better, or that it's going to satisfy your hunger. It's just somebody came up with the name Whopper. Well, someone came up with a test called viral load, and that implies certain things. Look at the test kit literature, and it says, quote, not intended to be used as a screening test for HIV or as a diagnostic to confirm HIV infection.
Well, then what is
right
it supposed to be?
Right there in the test kit literature.
Then what is it supposed to be? That doesn't make any sense.
It was approved as a prognostic test to predict or foretell a future outcome. It was never approved as a diagnostic test to say someone is or has, you are infected with disease, you have this disease. It wasn't approved for that use.
So it's just just a scam then, isn't it?
Well, everybody's using it as if.
Uh-huh.
And a study came out recently. I would encourage anybody interested in exploring this further to visit the website of the organization I run, aliveandwell.org. The News and Updates has information from a huge scientific study, more than 22,000 HIV positives, whose, quote, viral load was examined to see if it actually correlated with what they are calling immune dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
This test couldn't even predict immune dysfunction, yet it's approved as a predictive tool. This big study said it's wrong 90% of the time. It's wrong in predicting progression to disease or lack thereof 90% of the time.
Now, is this, what is the name, Christine, what is the name of this test, and is it the common test used?
It's called viral load. That's
load?
The trade name. It's called other things, branch DNA, RNA. It's got all kinds of different technical names, but this is the viral load test.
Is this the test that is commonly used to test people for supposedly having HIV or not?
This test is commonly used to confirm that someone actually, quote, has the virus, yet, as I just stated, the test itself says it cannot be used to confirm the presence of HIV infection, but that's exactly what we use it for. Let me give you another example. We have a screening test called an Eliza. It's supposed to be an HIV antibody test. I kid you not. The test kit literature says, quote, at this time, there is no established standard for establishing the presence or absence of HIV antibodies in human blood, end quote.
It says that on the test.
It says this is very surrealistic. Right now we have an exhibit at the LA County Art Museum of the famous French surrealist René Magritte. And anyone familiar with his work, there's a painting of a pipe, and it'll say underneath in French, this is not a pipe. That's called surreal. These tests are surreal. You have a test called an antibody test, and right on the test it says, at this time, there is no standard for establishing the presence or absence of HIV antibody in human blood. But here's your antibody test.
Yeah, Christine, what's the name of this test again? Is this the same one, viral load, or a different one?
It's known as the EIA or the ELISA, and it's an antibody test.
But if they can put that, right there, that's absolute, incontrovertible proof that the theory that HIV does not cause AIDS is true, and also that HIV doesn't even exist. It's like outright stating that in legalese, right?
Well, it's not. I don't think you can say that's incontrovertible proof of anything, except somebody needs to ask what's going on here. This is just ridiculous. You can actually use a test as a surrogate marker. If I have a test that can identify something in your body that proves to correlate 100%, 99%, 98% with an actual condition that I can identify, why not? Why not use that test? An antibody test would be fine, even if it had, as long as, this is what would need to happen. We would need to take 1,000 HIV positives, positive by positive antibody response, and determine through the direct isolation of the actual virus from these individuals' blood how many actually have whole infectious virus. If it's all 1,000, the test is 100% accurate. And it doesn't matter how it gets to that 100% accuracy. It can use, enzymes. It can use antibodies. It can test for certain proteins. If it can do it with a certain degree of accuracy, as verified, as validated through the gold standard of finding the problem 99% of the time, 98% of the time, fine. No one has ever done this with an antibody test. No study has ever been published in which these antibody tests were validated to be able to accurately tell us, of people who test positive, how many actually have virus, whole infectious virus that can be directly isolated from their blood or tissue. Never been done. So what have is,
it sounds to me like it's been a scam all along.
Well, what happened is these tests first came out as a way to screen the blood supply. And they were made to be very sensitive, that is to err on the side, like a car alarm. You want your car alarm to go off if somebody's going to break into it. But they're set to be very subtle. So, if somebody walks by and hits your side view mirror, your car alarm goes off. Well, that's probably better than having it not work when somebody's trying to break into your car. So they're purposely made that way. These screening tests were purposely made that way, to go off more than they wouldn't go off, so the blood supply could be, quote, safe. The only problem is then they started being used on people, and then somebody decided, well, antibody positive response is infection, with no scientific data to substantiate that grand leap of faith. Nothing. No isolation of the virus ever, according to classic, ethical, proper standards of isolation. No electron microscopic evidence of HIV. It's just leaps of faith, leaps of assumption, driven by fear, lobbying, other considerations that have nothing to do with science, put these things into place. And it's become institutionalized, it's become calcified, and we're dealing with the unfortunate fallout of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to get your opinion on a slightly different topic. What about SARS and the bird flu? They seem to be running in the same path as AIDS, meaning SARS. I actually went to China at the height of SARS in 2003, and I was absolutely convinced that it was an artificial, non-existent disease and also a cause of mass hysteria on the side. I think that it was designed to indoctrinate China into the pharmaceutical age.
I don't know what the motivation was behind it, but clearly we don't have a problem worldwide with SARS.
Right.
And there's a lot of questions that can be asked about why we thought we did. Bird flu, same thing. You know, where's the problem? There isn't one. And it's not like I'm sad that there isn't a problem, but why were we told to predict, to fear, to stockpile, to be wary, to implement policy? There was not a sound basis for that. We can go back many years and find this pattern. Every single flu season, I think the greatest disease the American people suffer from is amnesia. Because every single, quote, flu season, what do we get? We get SARS, we get avian flu, or we simply hear this will be the worst flu season ever since 1918 flu epidemic. Every winter this happens. Every winter the CDC promotes this idea, doctors, the pharmaceutical industry, getting a flu shot is equivalent to being a good person. And then after the years pass, go back and look at the CDC data and see how many people died of the flu in this country. Pretty much every year, 36,000 people.
Oh, okay.
Mostly elderly, mostly children, the people who are on cancer chemotherapies and otherwise immune suppressed. Mm-hmm. Every year, it's the same darn thing. And we've been hearing swine flu, never panned out. Hantavirus, what happened to that? It turned out to be a problem with people living in conditions where they were exposed to rodent species. Whatever happened to Legionnaires? Whatever happened to flesh-eating bacteria?
Mm-hmm.
We seem to exist as a population in this constant state of agitation and fear, and we're very easy to market to based on that.
And that brings us to bird flu. What is that? Is that the exact same thing?
From what I've seen, it appears to be the same thing. There's articles out now. Bird flu flew the coop.
Mm-hmm.
Where did the birds go? And some people say, oh, it's because of this, that, and the other thing, but what about SARS? Ebola. Remember Ebola?
I think so.
Yeah, if you try hard enough.
Yeah.
But I'm a better predictive tool than the viral load test because I promise you next winter, there will be the prediction of our imminent demise. Mm-hmm. And there's going to be all kinds of, people were scenario planning for when businesses had to shut down and how things would work with the bird flu. And the bird flu is just, as the one article I read said, flew the coop. Whoops.
Now, Christina, let me ask you a personal question. Do you take any sort of AIDS medications?
No, that's a good question to ask. No, since I tested positive in 1992, which, by the way, it's my 15th anniversary next month of testing positive, I've never taken any kind of AIDS treatment at all, pharmaceutical or otherwise. After I tested positive, I was told I was too healthy to take the drugs right away because they can make you very, very sick. And I felt like I was on my own. I thought it was insane that I should sit around and wait to get sick to try to get better, but back then I didn't know what I know now. What happened as a result of me wanting to take charge of my life is I got into investigating vitamins, minerals, supplements, herbs, and all of a sudden I went from someone who I was bad, got to eat breakfast, donut. Got to eat lunch, go to the liquor store and get a tuna sandwich and a thing of Snapple.
Mm-hmm.
Dinner, let's order out Chinese, MSG, I don't know, what's that? Don't feel good, go to the doctor, get a prescription. That was me. That was me until somebody said I was going to die and there was nothing they could do about it. And all of a sudden I got very interested in research on what the heck I was going to do since nobody seemed able to help me. I started researching vitamins, minerals, supplements, herbs, alternative, as they're called, therapies. I think they're just sensible. Whenever you deal with the root cause of a problem and you're open-minded about what that cause could be, I think you're approaching healthcare from the most responsible position possible. And that's what I've done over the years. And I'm human too, you know. We're all going to die. In this country, we look at death as failure. You know, we're always fighting to stay alive. So, you know, stuff happens to everybody. But I think that treating the stuff that happens and looking at the stuff that happens. Why am I feeling this way? After my daughter died, I could not breathe. I could not physically breathe. I was hacking, I was coughing, I had shortness of breath. It was like I suddenly became asthmatic. I could not breathe. I went to the doctor 3 times. Nothing physical could be found. Mm-hmm. Finally, what happened was we took a trip. We went to Hawaii. We learned yoga. I started just to try to calm down. Within 2 weeks, I was snorkeling. I went from not being able to breathe to snorkel. People who saw what I went through after my daughter died saw me where one evening there were a bunch of people over at our house, and I sat down to join them for dinner. There was some laughter. I was part of it. I sat down, and I couldn't breathe. And I started choking and coughing. I had to run into. I coughed so hard I threw up. I realized I sat in my daughter's place. Mm-hmm. And on some level, I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden I was dying in my mind. I learned so much through this experience of my daughter's death, which has been tragic, and at the same time, there's been so much beauty involved in this, of the beauty of other people. That I don't know. It's been an incredible and difficult experience. But what I learned is there were 2 times I almost died for no physical reason, and that says a lot about where we need to look when we're trying to find what is causing us to be unwell.
Now that we are on the topic of your daughter, do you want to give us just tell us what happened, basically?
Well, anybody who wants to know more can visit a website that has a lot more information called Justice for EJ. Her name's Eliza Jane.
Okay, so that's justiceforej.com.
Correct, yeah. And basically what happened is this. I have 2 children. My son is 9. He was born in 97. And my daughter was born in December of 2001. In both cases, I became pregnant naturally. In both cases, after the age of 40, here I am supposed to be this immune-suppressed person, and, you know, why would that happen? And in both cases, I had extraordinarily healthy, normal, great pregnancies, and in both cases, I had natural birth. My son and daughter, they look almost exactly alike, and they were raised in the same manner. I did not take any medications while pregnant nor afterwards, and after careful research, I decided to breastfeed both my children to give them the absolute essential form of nutrition provided in breast milk and antibody protection. We used to think antibodies were good things to have before the HIV paradigm, and schizophrenically we still do because there's vaccine programs to give people protective antibodies. I wanted the best for my kids. And what I got were 2 beautiful, healthy, amazing, intelligent, funny children. Just beautiful people. Nothing remarkable to report. No vaccines. That was another issue I researched very, very carefully and remain open to if there's a reason to that is compelling and the science is there, happy to do so. But the evidence so far in our lives has been not necessary. Both children very active in school, community, neighborhood, moving around, unvaccinated children, vaccinated children and unvaccinated one. People call schools a petri dish because of all the germs. Kids are fine. My daughter gets a ear infection and a cold in April of 2005, late April. Her first doctor's appointment relevant to this was on April 28th, and her medical record prior to that is, you know, normal kid. Diaper rash once, a cold once. She had chicken pox when the entire kindergarten at school got chicken pox. Her brother brought it home and chicken pox. But, that's like the most remarkable things about her. To make a very long and tragic and terrible story short, we saw 3 pediatricians because of the circumstances of the work that I do, and because one of the pediatricians was visiting here, who I have a very high regard for and I've always admired and trusted, and I saw it as an opportunity to we get together socially, and he sees the kids. And in this particular instance, I wanted another opinion about my daughter, because frankly, my mom's intuition was just on high alert. And everyone agreed on the same thing. Pneumonia was completely ruled out, and that was done on purpose because we had whooping cough and pneumonia circulating in our school that winter. Everything that wasn't an ear infection was ruled out in her case. And 2.5 weeks into this, when natural treatments that all 3 pediatricians recommended were not clearing the fluid in her ear and there was redness, on May 14th, a doctor came to see her at our house and prescribed an antibiotic, and we filled the prescription later that evening. My daughter, just to give you an indication, sat at the kitchen table with him and had a popsicle before he left. She associated his tongue depressor with a popsicle, so I gave her a popsicle that I made out of fruit juice, no sugar and all that stuff. So I would just, to be consistent with what I say, I do walk my talk. Mm-hmm. We gave her the antibiotic that night. That morning, she didn't seem to be feeling well. We understood that the antibiotic could cause vomiting. And she spit up a couple times that day. It wasn't like retching, vomiting, head-spinning, vomiting. She was just spitting up. Kids do that. Later that day and evening, though, she started to seem like something was wrong. And when I felt her, she was cold but sweaty. And I came back from dinner. My husband had been with her, and her eyes were darting around the room. And she was making this weird sound, and I said, call the pediatrician. This doesn't seem right. Something seems really wrong. But since I had seen 3 pediatricians for a total of 4 visits, and everyone assured me, one pediatrician who was very supportive up until the Los Angeles Times article about my daughter's death, actually his advice to us was, take her to the park, get her out, open the windows. So, this is the advice I was going. My daughter had an ear infection. She's fine. Boy, you're so lucky she's not sick like all these other kids. And all of a sudden, something is really wrong. So I was embarrassed to call the pediatrician. I was folding a blanket at the end of the bed, and I said, Robin, this is not right. So he called the pediatrician, and as he's talking to her, my daughter died.
Oh, no.
Went into cardiac arrest and died right there in front of us. Of course, we hung up the phone. I started screaming. He called 911. And an ambulance came and managed to revive our daughter and bring her to a nearby emergency room, where for the next 4.5 hours, they tried to keep her alive while trying to figure out what was wrong. There was nothing that was apparent from looking at her. There was nothing apparent through 2 chest x-rays, a CAT scan, a spinal tap, all kinds of blood work. And she died. Because there was nothing apparent from any of their observations, the tests, they sent her to the LA County Coroner's Office for an autopsy. The autopsy was performed on May 18th. We spoke to the medical examiner immediately following the autopsy, and she told us no apparent cause of death. Very sorry, they could not see what had caused our daughter to die. Uh-huh. And they would continue to search for an explanation.
I'm sorry, but I'm sorry to ask this. I know this is a personal subject, but I feel the need to ask this. I mean, didn't you find that suspicious that they just came up with this determination that there was no apparent cause of death?
No, it was hard to live with, but there's something called SIDS. It usually happens to younger kids where they die and they just die.
Yeah, sudden infant
There was
death
also a
syndrome.
mom at school, a teacher at school, who came over when she heard that Eliza Jane died and said, the same thing happened to me. My son was said to have this mild cold. He was at home, gave him an antibiotic, and then he's dead. And she said that it took a long time to find out what caused his death. And she actually recommended to me that we hire an independent coroner and to have someone there during the autopsy, but I thought that sounded, I tend to think, I want to trust people to do their jobs and to be honest and right, and in that situation, I just trusted that the system would do what it's supposed to do, which is find out why my daughter died without prejudice, without manufacture of evidence or anything else. They would just find out why my daughter died and tell us that. That's their job. That's what taxpayers pay them for. And what happened instead is they couldn't find a cause of death. On May 18th, they examined many, many things, including her lungs, and with her lungs reported no inflammation of the lung. I mention this because 4 months later, on September 16th, they concluded that my daughter died of AIDS pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
Pneumonia is defined as inflammation of the lung caused by disease. On May 18th, there was no inflammation in my daughter's lungs. On September 16th, they're saying she died of AIDS pneumonia. She had no cough. She did not struggle for breath. There's nothing in the autopsy report to indicate any damage caused by a lack of oxygen. There were 2 chest x-rays done at the hospital. I'm sure if she had fulminant life-threatening pneumonia, somebody would have seen something in those chest x-rays. I'm sure when they performed the autopsy, if she had fulminant life-threatening fatal pneumonia, no one would have said no inflammation of the lungs and called us up and said, we haven't found anything. But that's what happened. That's what happened. And, you know, the story goes on, and we don't have evidence of a positive HIV test for our daughter. Not that I hold that to be a standard of anything, because the test manufacturers don't even do that.
Yeah.
But you might want to buy the story a little more if somebody had at least come up with that. And then we have this other discrepancy to the story. My son, who had never been tested previously, when we saw what they were doing here with our daughter's death, we knew that the Department of Child and Family Services would be alerted and would come and try to take our son away based on the premise that he was at risk.
Oh, jeez.
And sure enough, I knew it. I felt it. I could feel him coming. So we went out and had 2 tests done, but I wanted to have 3, because the magic number when you're contesting this issue is 3. If you get 3 negative tests, well, then you're negative. My son had 2. And we were at a lab going for number 3 when the Department of Child and Family Services showed up at our front door, coming to talk to us about taking our son away. But we had 3 negative tests, so that kind of put the whole thing on standstill. But they still tried to take him away, and they demanded a 4th negative test before they would leave us alone. But they wouldn't even leave us alone then, actually. They still kept trying to take him away, examining his school records, talking to teachers, visiting with neighbors. They were just looking to take our son away. Why? He's a perfectly healthy HIV-negative kid living in a loving home with 2 parents who work their lives around being with him, and the same with his sister. Goes to a lovely school, private school, and has friends, family, and they're trying to take him away from us. Why? It's been crazy. It's been absolutely crazy. My husband took tests at the same time as our son. We didn't know how to frame this to him. He's 8 years old, so we told him, because his birthday's in September, we're giving you an 8-year-old checkup. And so he had to submit to all these different tests, and my husband did it to be there with him at the same time. And my husband, my partner of 10 years, through 10 years of totally unprotected sexual contact and everything else, is negative.
Uh-huh.
Rule, it just takes once. Watch out. It's out there to get you. Well, how come that doesn't apply in our family? It's not just our family, by the way. Many, 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 many families, many couples.
When was the last time you took an HIV test?
2001.
And what did it come up?
Positive.
Positive. And how do you explain that? What is your feelings on it?
I don't know. I don't think anybody can say why a test comes up positive, because we don't know what the tests are testing for.
Right, but when you took it,
antibody response to protein.
Did you fill out some sort of like a questionnaire stating that you this and that and the other thing, that you had it before, whatever?
No,
You didn't.
no, but my name was on there. And
Your name was on it. Well, I mean, that right there.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, people have had the experience of testing in one place and giving one set of supposed facts about themselves, testing in another and giving another supposed set of facts about themselves and getting different results.
Yeah, but I mean, you might be known to them. I mean, it's probable that
Yeah,
you would.
but you know what? You know what? I don't care. I don't care about the positive test result. I don't base my life around it. Other people are more interested in that than I am. And the stories that come up about me are hilarious. I just read an article that was actually published in June that refers to another article that somebody wrote who didn't know my daughter died. And in this article, this woman is going on and on about how I'm a false positive and I don't have HIV, because if I did, I would be sick and my kids wouldn't be well. And I know this, and I faked the whole being HIV positive as a racket, quote, to sell denialism. On and on about how I'm not really positive. Ooh, and then they want to say at the same time, talking out of the other side of their mouth, that my daughter died of AIDS. Ooh, and talking out of the same side of their mouth, they don't have a positive test, nor do they have the physical evidence that would constitute a reasonable assessment to suggest any kind of pneumonia. It's just nutty to me what is said and what is correct, what is fact and what is myth. It's just remarkable. Recently, I did a pap smear, and the only reason I would ever go on a program and talk about my pap smear is because the world is very interested in my pap smear. Why? Because in 2002, I wrote an article about the very disconcerting experience of having 3 conflicting pap smear test results. My first one said I was precancerous, that I had indications of cervical dysplasia, and the doctor that administered it immediately wanted me to have some tissue samples taken, and I said, wait. I don't have a lot of faith in diagnostic tests. Let's just do it again and see what happens before we start going for, the worst case scenario. Let's just do it again. We did it again, and suddenly I don't have that condition that was so alarming, but it suggested that I might have human papillomavirus. That seemed equally improbable to me because that's supposed to be sexually transmitted. I've been in a monogamous relationship for more than a decade. I've had regular pap smears before. And P.S., whoever tests men for HPV, and it's supposed to be sexually transmitted, hello, is there an HPV test for men? Where did this come from if it's sexually transmitted? Anyway, I won't get into that. So I did the pap smear again. What I did is I tried to act in the most responsible manner I could think. I said, okay, let's accept the worst case scenario. I have cervical cancer. What would I do? What am I going to do? And I took a natural, holistic approach, which has been widely criticized in all kinds of media. I did ozone therapy. I changed my diet. I did some organ cleanses. I did what I would do, I think, if somebody said you definitely have cancer. And then I went and got a pap smear done. Normal. But no one wanted to let that go. I am described in the Los Angeles Times in September of 2005 as someone who's walking around with some AIDS-like condition due to a pap smear that was bad in 2002. Another article came out, said the same thing, and then it started being like a game of telephone among toddlers where she has AIDS and she's ignoring it, all based on 3 conflicting pap smear results in 2002 that resolved in a normal pap smear. So I went out and got a pap smear just before the Christmas holidays with the intention of just, let's just put this on the table. My pap smear is normal, negative for HPV. So that means, according to the mainstream media, I just cured myself of 2 conditions that would be a challenge for any woman, let alone one at age 50 who's been HIV positive for 15 years. How did I do that?
If you could control things, how would you change things, and what do you see for the future of AIDS?
I would, if I could control things, I would control by liberating. I would work very hard to liberate people from fears based on unfounded claims about lots of things, and just get down to the realities of what's going on and what we can all do about that to make our lives better and healthier and happier and the world a better place.
And what do you see happening in the future with AIDS? Are they going to come out with a vaccine or a cure or something and then say, okay, well, we found the cure, so now you got to pump this in through your veins for 6 months and then you're cured of AIDS? What do you think?
I don't think that, no. If you notice the shift is, at the beginning it was a great catchphrase, be here for the cure. There's no talk about that. It's a chronic manageable condition, which coincidentally is great because you have a longer period of time to sell your product to people. You sell them a cure, that's it. They get it, it's gone. What are you going to do?
Right.
But with the treatment, it's chronic. You're using it every day. You got to buy it every day. You got to buy it every month. You got to buy it every year. And then it causes all kinds of problems for which you need more treatments that you buy every day and buy every month and buy every year. And you got to go get your labs done to make sure your liver enzymes aren't getting too high. These AIDS drugs cause some remarkable conditions that are very, very serious. Bone death. Bone necrosis is one of the things that these AIDS drugs cause, along with anemia, muscle wasting, fatigue, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, sleep disorders, pancreatic conditions, diabetes, elevated cholesterol, leading to heart attacks and strokes in young people. They're remarkably toxic drugs. And you want to be sure if you're going to use something like that, there's a very good reason. There's a risk-benefit ratio. Now, I don't see that risk-benefit ratio being there. People don't need to agree with me and not take the drugs or stop taking the drugs because they may see in their mind to them a risk-benefit ratio. I support everybody's right to make their own informed decisions. I just hope their decisions are informed and they're not informed by fear, but by the facts of the matter and by the authority of their own lives. I could have believed that I was sick after my daughter died. I couldn't breathe. It would have been very easy to find somebody, I'm sure, that would tell me, well, you finally have AIDS now. We need to get you on these drugs. I lost weight. I wasn't eating. I was really depressed. I was struggling.
Well,
somebody could have called that wasting.
When you were describing that earlier, I've actually experienced something like that very briefly in my life, and I think that it actually is psychological, and it's almost like a neuroses that builds up. It's really just fear manifest as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, and if you live in fear long enough, it damages your body because fear, we produce a chemical called cortisol. When we're stressed, when we're fearful, when we're anxious, when we're upset, it suppresses the immune system.
Oh.
So if you live long enough in fear, it will cut back on your life and quality of life, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
A classic example is a gentleman in San Francisco area named Jim Malone who was told in 1998 that he was HIV positive. It made sense to him to be told that because he had had 2 lovers who had died of what was called AIDS. So he accepted that as true and correct and began living as though that were true. And while he was prescribed no medications, he got sick and got sicker, didn't leave the house, lost a bunch of weight, couldn't sleep at night. He had eventually, but 8 years fast forward, he's this emaciated, broken-spirited man who's got a visiting nurse, and his doctor's telling him he's getting very close to death. His doctor called it 3rd stage AIDS, 4th being terminal. Yet every time he'd go in to see the doctor, his immune system markers appeared normal, and he had no significant viral load, but he had AIDS and had tested positive. He ended up retesting 8 years later. He was negative. And I talked to him after, of course, they repeated this and found he was consistently negative, and the doctor actually admitted it had all been a mistake.
Wow.
This man gave himself AIDS. And when I talked to him on the phone, he hadn't been out of the house. He hadn't been anywhere. He didn't even want to walk up to the corner market. He told me he could only sleep in about 20-minute stretches, and that once he lay down for a nap and saw the Grim Reaper coming toward him.
Oh, my God.
It ruined his life. And after he found out he was negative, he went off some of his medications for his stomach disorders, and I mean, things were starting to look up for him. and he became alive again. He became normal again. He became a human being with all the, possibilities and challenges, because all of a sudden he had to give up government assistance.
Yeah.
But he was alive again. That is a famous story. It was on CNN. Every newspaper went all around the world. Jim Malone. You don't have to take my word for it. There's evidence. There's information. There's studies, and there are people, and they're there. They exist. It's real.
What is your take on the whole Magic Johnson situation? I mean, he was diagnosed in 1990, and he's still around. He's probably still playing basketball. But he's also doing something that I consider a little bit more sinister, which is advertising, being a poster child for certain AIDS drugs.
Yeah, I can't comment on what he's doing, what motivates him, but I can say that a couple years ago, I was sitting in a waiting room somewhere flipping through a magazine, and I found an ad with Magic Johnson on it, and I saved it. In this ad, Magic Johnson is holding in his hand a product called Natrol, or maybe it's made by Natrol, called Immune Boost or Immune Support. I have it in my office, and when we do our monthly presentations, I show this to people. Magic Johnson is holding this natural immune system booster, and there's a quote from him with his signature below it, and he's got a big smile on his face, and he says that he takes it every day to boost his immune system. You look at the Combivir ads, he advocates for a drug called Combivir, and I can't find a quote where he says, I'm taking this every day. So it's implied, it's suggested, but I don't see him holding it and smiling and signing his name below it and saying, I take this every day like I do with that other stuff. So I'm not sure what that means, but I'll tell you something interesting about Combivir. The ad that Magic Johnson is in says, Combivir helps, this is a quote, Combivir helps people with HIV live longer, healthier lives, end quote. There's no asterisk after that references a published study. So I called the company that makes this product, GlaxoSmithKline, and asked where I could find the data to substantiate that quote. They referred me to their website. There's a study there called the Caesar study, never been published in a medical journal. They compared 3 groups of people. One group taking whatever they wanted that they were already taking plus one of the ingredients in Combivir. The second group was people taking whatever they were taking plus one of the ingredients in Combivir plus an unidentified drug that had never been approved for use in the United States and is not named. And then there was a third group that were just taking whatever it was they were taking when they started this study. The difference in mortality, the difference that would support the claim that this helps people with HIV live longer lives, the greatest difference between the 3 groups is 2.9%. The people taking one ingredient in Combivir plus whatever they were taking plus an unnamed, unlicensed, unidentified drug were able to survive in this particular study. They had a 2.9% advantage over the 2 other groups of people. And that's supposed to constitute a life-saving drug when that kind of a number in science and medicine is supposed to be, normally it's considered statistically insignificant. Mm-hmm. So why he advocates for a drug whose claims are based on an unpublished study of dubious nature, I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us in our quest for the truth.